In this video, we're going to talk about how to use OpenAI from Docassemble so that you can send information from a Docassemble interview to OpenAI and then take the data from OpenAI and bring it back into Docassemble. The first thing you need to do is to go and create an API key over at OpenAI. To do that, go to OpenAI's website, create a profile. You'll need to create a paid account and then follow the process for creating an API key. Once you have that API key, keep it secret, but you're going to need to bring it over to Docassemble and put it in the Docassemble configuration file. To get to the configuration file, you're going to click up here at your username and go down to configuration. You can see here in my configuration file that I've defined an OpenAI key up here at the top. This is not my actual OpenAI key. Yours will look like some sort of long random configuration of numbers and upper and lowercase letters. Once you've defined this in the configuration file, click Save and then go back to the playground. Once you're back in the playground, you're going to want to create a new interview file. So I'm going to click Add here and call my interview file OpenAI EX for experiment, and then add .yaml at the end and go ahead and save it. Now that I have my empty interview file, I'm also going to create a new module to hold the code that calls the OpenAI API. So under folders, I'm going to right click on modules and open it in a new tab. And here on modules, I'm going to go ahead and create a new module file that I'm going to call OpenAI _API and then end it with .py because it's a Python file. I'll put the word pass in there just as a holder and then save the empty module so that the system can restart and see the module. The next thing I need to do is go back to my admin menu over here and go to package management. OpenAI has a Python package that you will need to install into Docassemble in order to make use of it. Over here in package management, you're going to see all of these menus here where it says install or update a package. What you need to do is go down to the blank where you can specify a package on PyPy and put in OpenAI and then click on the update button. Once that package is installed and the system has restarted, I'm going to go back to the playground and go back to my module. So back inside my blank module, I'm going to write the following Python code. Instead of recording myself tediously typing out all of this code, I decided to just go ahead and type it out and restart the video so that I could explain what's going on. Up here at the top, I have the first line from docassemble.base.util import git config. What this does is it tells Docassemble to go and get things from the configuration file using the git config function. So that means anything that I put in my configuration file, as you'll remember, we put our OpenAI API key into the config file. So now I can go and get it from the config file. I'm also importing the OpenAI module that we installed into our packages directory. Here on the third line, I'm defining the OpenAI.API key with the equal sign as getConfig and then parentheses OpenAI key. This is telling Docassemble to go and get the OpenAI key variable from the config file and set the OpenAI.API's key to that value. So now OpenAI has access to my API key, and I can call the API using this function. Down here on line 5, I'm creating a function, send to OpenAI, with parentheses, and it has one variable that I'm feeding into it called user input. Starting here on line 6, I'm using the try and accept method so that it handles any errors that may come up and will still run even if there's an error, and it will return the error to me and tell me what it is. If you haven't used try and except methods in Python, they're very handy for error handling. I'm not going to fully explain them here, but I recommend that you check them out. On line 7, this is where the actual operation is taking place. So I'm saying to return OpenAI.chatCompletion.create. This is a built-in function of the OpenAI API to create a chat completion based on what you're feeding into it. The first thing I'm defining is the model, GPT 3.5 Turbo, and then I'm setting messages to send to OpenAI. So a bit of explanation here. There are two types of messages that I'm sending. The first, and you'll see here, role, and then is system, and then the content of that message. This is considered the prompt that you're sending to the OpenAI model to tell it what it's supposed to do. So under content, this is where I actually write the prompt. And this is the example that we're going to be using. Feel free to use any prompt that you want, but this is what we're using for our example. Our prompt is, you are a famous chef who can create a good recipe using any ingredients. Please use the ingredients that the user gives you and write a good recipe using all of them. So when we send our API message to OpenAI, OpenAI is given these instructions in order to know how to complete the chat that comes next. Here in the second part, I have role user, and then the content that the user is sending is the user input that we're passing into this function, and that's what OpenAI is going to see, read the instructions, and then create a completion to complete the chat circuit on that and send it back to us. Here under max tokens, I've set it to 4,000 so that we can get a long response. Tokens have to do with the number of letters or words that the AI is allowed to use when creating a completion. And then the temperature I've set to 0.4. If you're unfamiliar with temperature, you can think of this as how much do you want the AI to make things up. It can be creative if you set the temperature at a high value. It can be determinative where it doesn't make things up at a low value. But be aware that even if you set temperature to 0 or 0.01 in some cases, it may still be able to flub things and make things up because generative AI is still very unpredictable. Here on line 15, this is where we handle our errors. Accept exception as E, return E. Essentially, this is telling the function that if an error occurs, go ahead and run it and return the error instead of returning what OpenAI sends back. This is very useful for debugging, and it doesn't shut down the system if there's an error when making an API call. I'm going to go ahead and save, and now I'm going to go back to the playground. Okay, now that I'm back at the playground, I've cheated a little bit, and I've also saved you the pain of watching me type things in tediously. I'll just go through and explain them line by line so you know what's going on. I'll also post the YAML and the code that I'm using so that you can just copy it and see what's going on there as well. Up here at line 1, you'll see I have modules and then .OpenAI API. You'll remember that's what we called our module that we saved. So I need to bring it into my interview and let Docassemble know that it's there and that it's usable. Here, starting on line 4, I have my one question, list the foods you have, and then the sub question I put in, I'll create a delicious recipe using them. Bon appetit. And here under fields, I have one field that I've called food. I put in no label because I want it to be large. And I set the data type to area. This will give a large block for people to list all the foods that they want this recipe to include. And then I close out my question with the 3 hyphens. Down here on line 18, you'll see I have the code block. And then I define a variable called response or RESP. And then I use my function from my module called send to OpenAI. You'll see it here. And remember, we are feeding our function one thing that I called user input there. But I want to feed it the foods that the person is putting into the area block. Now what I'm doing here is I'm making sure that OpenAI is getting this as a string and not as a Docassemble object. So I'm using the Python function str and then open and close parentheses and putting foods in the middle. That will make sure that it's converted to a string. And then here on line 12, I have my ending block. It's the last block of this interview, even though it's above the code, because it has the mandatory is true designator. My last question is your recipe, and then I'm returning the result of this code here, an RESP. As you'll remember, RESP is the result of our function send to OpenAI, and I'm returning whatever OpenAI is giving me back into the question. So with that, I'm going to click save, and I don't see any errors on the right-hand side, so I think we're good to go. I'm going to try it out with save and run, and you'll see our question lists the foods you have, and it will create a delicious recipe. So let's list in some foods. We'll go ahead and click continue, and this may take a moment. OpenAI's API is not the fastest API because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes. So here's our final screen, and you'll see we have something that looks a little bit like code, but if you read through it, you'll see that it actually contains our recipe. So we have recipe, savory sardine and raisin milk soup with celery garnish. Ingredients are 2 cups milk, 1 cup grass clippings, washed thoroughly, that's important when you're using any kind of grass clippings, a 1/2 cup raisins, 1 can of sardines and oil, 2 stalks celery thinly sliced. And then it'll lead you through how to actually make this very interesting and frankly not very appetizing dish. You'll also see down here at the bottom that it's using a role of assistant, some signifiers here on an ID, the model that it uses, what its object was, which was chat completion, how many tokens it used, total tokens, things like that. But let's say for our end user, we don't want to show them all of this stuff because frankly, it's a little bit hard to read through. Also, it has these new line symbols, the /n and /n3, things like that. Those are a little bit hard to read and parse as well. So what we want to do is return just the recipe section of this return value. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to the playground, and I'm going to modify what we're seeing, the RESP, which is the result of this function, so that it chooses just this section here, where it says content, and then it gives me the recipe. So I'm copying and pasting this in, but it's useful to talk through what it's doing. You'll see that I have these little brackets here with choices, and then a 0, and then message, and then content. So let's go back and look at what we're getting back. So when it's returning JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, which is a fancy way of saying structure the data in this way, it's creating almost like a tree that you can pick and choose what you want to see. So the first value is choices, and then the actual value of choices is what comes after this colon here. And you'll see that we have brackets and then another bracket down here at the bottom. This is signifying that there is a list of choices that come after choices. There's only one item inside choices, and it's this one. So if you remember anything about Python programming, the first value of a list is always designated as 0. So we have give me the value of choices, and then give me the first thing in that list, and then give me the value of message. So you see our first thing is this after choices, but what I really want to get down to is what comes after message. And you'll see message has a colon, and then another set of brackets here with content. So I say give me the value of message. Then once I have the value of message, give me the value of content. Right there. So again, it's response, and then give me the value of choices, the first thing in that list after choices, whatever is the message, and then the value of content. So let's save it, and then we can just reload to see if we did it the right way. And that looks much, much better. So now our recipe is actually formatted in a nice way. It created a list of instructions, very detailed on how to add the grass clippings to our milk soup and how to serve. You can garnish it with thinly sliced celery, and the celery adds a refreshing crunch and balances the flavor of the grass clippings and the raisins and sardines. So now you can see just how to incorporate OpenAI's API into a Docassemble interview using not very many lines of code. Generative AI is very powerful, and it is a very useful tool if you know what you're doing with it, probably not creating grass soup recipes.